Reading from the book of Exodus. It now some 4 years after Joseph had welcomed his brothers into Egypt, and the families of the 12 brothers had grown in great number. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labour. They built cities, Pithom and Ramesses, for the Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians subjected to the Israelites to hard servitude and made their lives bitter, with hard servitude in mortar and bricks and in every kind of field labour. They were ruthless in all the tasks that they imposed on them. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, of one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, "When you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, kill him, but if it is a daughter, she shall live." But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this and allowed the boys to live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them." So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live." Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and plastered it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river while her attendants walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child. He was crying and took pity on him. "This must be one of the Hebrews' children," she said. Then his sister said to the Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, because she said, "I drew him out of the water."
My reading comes from the Gospel of Luke. When Jesus came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour." And he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. Then he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing."
Hello everyone, is this working? Thank you for having me here today. My name is Megan, if you don't know me already. Now I actually teach Old Testament. I teach Old Testament and Hebrew, which is the language in which most of the Old Testament is written, at a place called Whitley College, which is the Baptist College of Victoria. Now, this is completely normal to me, but actually it can be quite surprising to people when I tell them, yeah, this is how I spend my life. I have dedicated a good portion of my life learning more about the Old Testament, trying to understand better what it means. In fact, this is probably one of the main reasons why I avoid going to the hairdresser, strangely enough. Yes, bear with me. It's that dreaded question, so what do you do? Yeah, it's a bit baffling for a lot of people to think that this is a job to teach people about the Old Testament. And in addition to that, I'm not a pastor, I'm not a minister, I'm not even always a Bible, Sunday school teacher. And I have to say, even sometimes my fellow Christians look at me kind of a little bit with a side eye, a little bit strangely. You teach that Testament, that old one? What about the new one? That's the one that we're on about. But we are told in 2 Timothy that all scripture is God-breathed. And I do strongly believe that the Old Testament can, if we give it a bit of time, a bit of careful attention, it can still speak to us today about God's character, our place within a community or a people of God, and our responsibilities towards God, to one another, towards creation. So today I want to speak to you about the faithful women of Exodus and what we might learn from them. Originally it was actually more like 20 minutes, and Paul said, no, make it 30, it can be longer. So if it's boring and long, send your complaints over there. All right, the story of the Israelites' redemption from slavery. It's likely to be familiar to all of us, at least in its broad strokes. Even people who do not identify as Christians know the general story. It's part of our cultural consciousness. It's actually also a great story, a great yarn. You can do the next slide. If you were born before 1959 or thereabouts, perhaps if I mention Exodus, it conjures up a picture of Charlton Heston, the glorious, lustrous beard waving around the 10 Commandments. Or perhaps you get visions of Christian Bale as Moses, a man who struggles with his identity, a hybrid identity as an Israelite Egyptian, and eventually he must come up against his former, this is the next slide. Eventually he must come up against his former brother, who is the Pharaoh, and for some reason, inexplicably, it's played by an Australian actor, Joel Edgerton, and has a very broad Aussie accent. Perhaps this Exodus story evokes for you an animated Moses with the voice of Val Kilmer from The Prince of Egypt. And next slide, that beautiful score as well by Hans Zimmer. Now, if we be a little bit more serious, the Exodus tradition is actually extraordinarily important. This is the next slide. It's the greatest redemptive event in the Old Testament. It's an event to which subsequent revelation points to again and again and again. And there's some examples listed up there. But in fact, there's probably no better example of this than the famous Isaiah 61 text, which is recited by Jesus in Luke 4. In Isaiah 61 verse 1, mentions the release of captives. That is actually alluding to a series of biblical laws in Leviticus 25, Deuteronomy 15 and others, and these all required the release of Israelite slaves after a set period of time. These laws were themselves going back to the release of the Israelites from slavery, to the Exodus event. And so you've got this ongoing story that just keeps reverberating forward. So the delivery from enslavement to Pharaoh is a physical salvation, but of course it is also something more. I'm going to get into the Hebrew a little bit, bear with me. Rather than slaving from the Hebrew avad to Pharaoh, The Hebrews must be free so that they may serve or worship, the same root word here, avad, God, okay? And this service is within the context of a special covenant or treaty. This is a really intimate, special relationship that binds the Israelites to God. And we see this coming up in Exodus 19, chapters 19 to 24. Of course, for Jews, the Exodus tradition forms the basis of Passover, Pesach. And that's one of the most important Jewish festivals, holidays, which is actually coming up April 22nd, beginning April 22nd. For Christians, this story of redemption, a story of salvation from slavery, becomes a forerunner for the redeeming work of Christ, as we see in Luke. But everyday folk, theologians, people all around the world have looked to the Exodus story, and in it they have discerned, they have recognised their own God-given worth, their own dignity, their own right to freedom. They've also found a model for their own struggle toward liberation from circumstances that are degrading, that are inhumane. Exodus was important for the abolitionist movement in England, the US and the Caribbean. That is, the fight to abolish nothing as horrific and sinful and dreadful as the transatlantic slave trade. Exodus formed the imagination of the great Baptist minister Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement, the end of segregation between black and white people in America. Since the 1960s, it's been invoked by people living in poverty and oppression in Latin America in their fight for social and economic justice. Yet, you might be forgiven, I might be forgiven, for thinking that Exodus is a narrative about men, that the act of redeeming or saving is in some way masculine. Sure, in the song that describes the crossing of the sea in Exodus 15, you've got Yahweh depicted as this great Israelite God who redeems as a great warrior, who triumphs over his enemies in battle. Moses is the one to whom God reveals himself at the burning bush. Moses is, of course, a man. He is tasked with the job of representing God in confronting the most powerful man in the world at the time, the Pharaoh. And he's given this very simple task, of bringing entire people out of slavery on God's behalf. Moses' brother is Aaron the priest, and he's given the task of being the spokesperson of Moses. But a closer look, a deeper look at the text reveals that women are truly heroes of the story. As we saw in the reading, women actually predominate in the first two chapters. It's their courage, their acts of civil disobedience, it's their love and their faith that secure the Israelites' survival. And so they bring about the nation's redemption. In fact, there are 12 important women in the opening chapters of Exodus, and it's their faithful behaviour, also their subversive behaviour, that contribute to this freedom that the 12 tribes of Israel will experience in their redemption. Okay, that's by way of introduction. Who are these women? We can get the next slide. We've got Shiphrah and Puah, the midwives. We've got a Levite woman, the mother of Moses, who's later called Jochebed in the text. We have the sister of Moses, later called Miriam. We have Pharaoh's daughter, who actually is unnamed in the text, but in a really lovely rabbinic Jewish tradition, they give her a name which is Batya, which means daughter of God. And then we have the 7 daughters of the Midianite priest Reuel, including Zipporah. Zipporah is a woman who will eventually marry Moses. That wasn't in the reading, it comes a bit later. Okay, let's set the scene a little bit. Next slide, I think. So background, Exodus 1, we've been told that this new king has arisen in Egypt. He does not know Joseph, remembering that Joseph actually began to be favoured by the empire, essentially. But this new king claims, Israelite people have multiplied, they've become a threat. They're too numerous, they're too powerful, they could be powerful against us. They might join against other people and fight against us in a war. So the Pharaoh orders that these people should be oppressed with forced labour and building cities. Quite remarkably, the building of the cities, which you think might be the purpose of this oppression, comes second. The primary purpose is simply to oppress. Yet, kind of ironically, no matter how many tasks the Israelites are given, they just keep multiplying. And this is where Shiphrah and Puah come in. The very first individual Israelites or Hebrews to be identified, to be named in the book of Exodus are two women, Shiphrah and Puah. These courageous women are the first to defy the nameless Pharaoh. They are remembered in history with names, Pharaoh is not. But Pharaoh has ordered that these midwives kill all male infants. When you act as midwives to the Hebrew women, see them on the birth stool. If it is a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, she shall live. This is scary stuff. Shiphrah and Puah, however, they respect divine authority, not the authority of the Pharaoh. They fear God. This is from the Hebrew word yareh. They fear God, and they do not do as the king of Egypt commanded them. This is the Hebrew word diber. Bear with me, the Hebrew is relevant, I swear. In biblical Hebrew, but also in this cultural context of the ancient Western Asia, fear is not just this emotion that we might associate it with of just being scared, of being terrified. It means to be in awe of someone, to actually honour them, to respect them, to have a sense of reverence. This word, if I can point forward again to Exodus chapters 19 to 24, comes up again. In that context, you have a story of the Israelites coming to this momentous mountain, Mount Sinai, and God, in a great theophany, in these massive weather events, actually descends onto this mountain. There's lightning, there's thunder, and it is an intense experience of God's presence. And the people are terrified, they are afraid. But also in this context, in this display of power, they learn to revere their God. Also in that context is where God actually delivers the content of this covenant, this thing that will bind the Israelites together with God in this deeply intimate relationship. You may not have heard this before, perhaps you have. The 10 Commandments are actually called 10 words. They are the 10 Devarim. This is the same root word that is used to describe what Pharaoh has commanded these women to do. Okay? So why is this woman talking to you about all these Hebrew words, on a Sunday morning? What I'm trying to get at here is that even before God appears to Moses in a theophany at the burning bush, which is coming up in chapters 3 and 6, even before God descends to Mount Sinai in this great theophany, before all of this, in this part of the narrative is making it clear that the midwives already revere God. They already want to follow the words and the commandments of God. They are the ones seeking to covenant with the God that they know, not Pharaoh. Next slide. So, Shiphrah and Puah, they defy the Pharaoh's command. They continue to let these infant boys live. These women also obscure the truth of what is happening to the Pharaoh himself, to his face. They claim, nah, it's fine. It's no one's fault. You know, the Hebrew women, they're just really, really vigorous when it comes to giving birth. So it's all happened before we can even reach them. The midwives are not just liars. They're not just being deceitful here. This is what we call trickster behaviour, when you have members of a group who are subordinate. They are members of a group who are oppressed. They appear to be powerless, yet they employ their own God-given wiliness, their own cleverness against the will of a powerful figure who would try and commit their people to genocide, essentially. In spurning the Pharaoh's genocidal decree, they engage in what we might call the first instance of civil disobedience, and this is long before Moses comes onto the scene. Not only this, their resistance is rewarded. We're told that God dealt well. In Hebrew, it can mean cause good with the midwives. The people multiply, they become stronger. And it specifically says that it is because the midwives feared God. And then he gives them, literally in Hebrew, houses, batim. Again, yes, she's going on about the Hebrew, but this word again is important. The NRSV translates it as families, but its literal translation is houses. And in fact, a house can be a dynasty. We have the house of David, which is a monarchic dynasty. Here, it's the women who are given their dynasties because of their faithful civil disobedience. All right, let's move on to the mother of Moses, the sister of Moses, and the daughter of the Pharaoh. And these women all work together. So we're told that the Hebrews, yes, they continue to multiply, and in response, Pharaoh now commands Sava in Hebrew, all his people to throw every boy that is born to the Hebrews into the Nile. Again, Hebrew word. Sava means to command, and it is a powerful word. Again, it's often used to describe God's covenantal laws, the commandment, that's Sava. Again, we have this sort of illusion. This Pharaoh is trying to act like God. Pharaoh is trying to be a god. In ancient Egyptian ideology or mythology, the Pharaoh was thought to be a representative of God on earth, or at least he presented himself that way. So Pharaoh is trying to act like God, and this raises the question, who will the Israelite people listen to, God or Pharaoh? Just like the midwives, this Levite woman, the mother of Moses, directly disobeys Pharaoh, and she does this at great risk to herself. She hides a baby, her baby, Moses, and the famous story that we all know, she places him in the papyrus basket and puts him in the reeds of the river to protect him. And here her role intersects with the sister of Moses. Miriam watches the basket, watches over him from a distance. I think next slide, maybe. This story is so familiar, at least it was to me, but just take a moment here. Can you imagine the terror that Miriam must have felt? She's watching as Pharaoh's daughter walks towards the basket, and the Pharaoh's daughter sees it in the reeds. Imagine how Miriam was watching, probably holding her breath. Perhaps there's panic, palpitations. She watches as her maid brings this basket to the Pharaoh's daughter, and she opens it up and sees a baby. Remarkably, at this moment, the baby cries, and this Egyptian woman, perhaps or most definitely the most powerful woman at the time in the ancient world, she's moved by this crying baby, this vulnerable Hebrew child who is supposed to be dead, who is supposed to be killed, who is living under a state-mandated death sentence. As if this wasn't all stressful enough, remember Miriam's watching all of this go down. She decides that it would be a really great idea to approach the Pharaoh's daughter and give her some advice, which is what we all do, right? When we're in, a genocidal situation. She says to the Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" For someone like me, I've always grown up in relative comfort, prosperity in a place like Australia. I think it can be easy for us to overlook this is an act of outright insubordination, if not treason, performed in front of the representative of this oppressive government. This is the Pharaoh's daughter. Yet, the Pharaoh's daughter agrees. The baby's own Hebrew mother is secured as a nurse to raise him and to care for him. Almost comically, the mother of Moses is no longer treated as a slave. She's actually given wages to raise her own child. This is the nature of the story unfolding. This defiant girl, Miriam, who, according to the calculations at this time, she was just a girl, she will later be called a prophet, a neviah in Hebrew. This is the same word as all of the male prophets, Jeremiah, Isaiah, etc. There's just an on the end, which indicates the grammatical feminine. She's a significant woman prophet, like Deborah, like Huldah, other female prophets. Now, prophets in ancient Israel, they had various functions, but we might actually summarise these by saying they were the speakspeople for and of God. And in that way, their role overlaps with priests. Priests also acted as a kind of a mediatory between God and the people through the functions of the temple. Many of us might be used to thinking of prophets as people who predict the future, right? And that is one of their roles. But one of their major functions is actually to speak directly into the present. We can see this during the period of the monarchy of ancient Israel, Saul onwards. What the prophets often do is hold the people with power to account. They speak into abuses of power, into systemic injustice, into exploitative practices. And this is the role that Miriam performs. She interferes in Egyptian policy by requesting that this woman Moses' own mother, raise this boy who is an enemy of the state. And what about this Egyptian woman, this Pharaoh's daughter? She has gone against the decree of her own father, a god on earth. She is collaborating with two Hebrew women slaves, one whom she is now actually paying. She's not really a slave anymore, she's being paid. And this woman is now harbouring a fugitive baby. When the baby is grown, he is adopted by this woman, the Pharaoh's daughter, and he is given an Egyptian name. Moses is an Egyptian name. Moses is raised by two women, a poor Hebrew slave and an Egyptian princess. All right, we're nearly getting there. Stay with me. Just want to talk a little bit about the 7 daughters of Reuel. We're told later on Moses grows up. He's been brought up essentially within this royal household, but he knows as well of his Hebrew identity because of his mother. He grows up and he sees that his own people are living under forced labour, and he witnesses a Hebrew slave being beaten mercilessly by an Egyptian taskmaster. And Moses kills him in response. Moses is again a fugitive now. And Pharaoh, remembering now Pharaoh is Moses' family, right? Pharaoh again wants to kill Moses. Moses flees to a place called Midian, and there he meets 7 daughters of a local priest. They're being harassed at a well. They're trying to water their sheep, and there are shepherds who are trying to harass them there. Moses, he's true to a Moses character. He saves the women, of course. But they also help secure his asylum. They praise Moses to their father, and Moses finds asylum there. One of the women, Zipporah, will go on to marry Moses, and she will actually later save him from death. in a mysterious event that's narrated in chapter 4. I could give you a whole message on that, but I won't go into that. Okay, let's wrap this up. What are some reflections that we can make on this incredible text? The message of the Exodus story is, of course, that God, our God, is a God who redeems. Our God is a God who liberates. Yes, we are told that God liberates us from sin. God liberates us from death. But God also desires that humanity, that his creation, should be free from physical exploitation, from degradation, and from enslavement. It's when our whole spirits, our hearts, and our whole body, when all of these things are free from other oppressive powers, it is then that we can best serve and worship God, the Creator who has given us life. While the redeeming and the saving work of Christ, that is of course unique, the church, the body of Christ, individuals, the followers of Christ, we are all called to imitate the ways of God. The Exodus story teaches us that God also redeems through the actions of ordinary people, faithful and ordinary people. And that's regardless, or perhaps it's through our unique identity, through our unique gender. Moses may be the dominant Israelite personality in the book of Exodus. He does become a very powerful figure, right? And leader. He's a prophet, he's a lawgiver, he's a priest. But before that, in Exodus chapters 1 to 2, it's these seemingly less powerful women who first they're the ones that discern the will of God. They're the ones that undermine the brutal genocidal practices. They collaborate across cultures and across religions and nation groups. This is a true interfaith, intercultural collaboration. And it's through this that they disrupt this incredibly oppressive political hierarchy represented by Pharaoh. In fact, all of this is made to look rather foolish in the face of what these women are doing. These subversive women who redeemed the Israelite people are, of course, faithful women. They are godly women. They are heroes. May we continue to look for them, listen to them in our scriptures and in our communities, and also in the world all around us. Thank you.